So I'm gonna leave it up there, and then once the recording comes, you can go on and read it.
Oh, it will be there.
It'll be right there, just where it is now. So the second thing I wanted to say, oh, she isn't here now, kept asking me about why I chose David. Why I wrote about David. Alexis asked that at least twice, 3 times.
Tell us anyway.
So I would say that in thinking about it, I'm kind of emotionally and intellectually drawn to creative, accomplished people who are deeply flawed, but leave lasting positive legacies. And the people, so examples for me, so I'm drawn to people like Teddy Roosevelt, who, I don't know what you know about Theodore Roosevelt, was virulently anti-native. Virulently, I mean, he made a statement that said, I don't believe that every good Indian is a dead Indian, but I believe that 9 out of 10 should be dead, and I don't know about the 10th. I mean, he was as anti-Native American as you could be, even though he was so pro-land, and so were they. Anyway, but he's interests me, or I would say Jefferson interests me more than Adams, if that makes sense to those who know American history. Or in Jewish terms, Moses, it's why Jesus's life doesn't interest me, because he's painted as perfect, and that's not interesting to me. Abraham and Moses are interesting as they're depicted in the Torah, not as the rabbis depict them. I'm less interested in the way they smooth out, Abraham and Moses in rabbinic literature. I mean, there are nice lessons they derive, and I use those, but the characters of Moses and Abraham, or Sarah and Rachel in the Bible, are full characters, flawed characters who do positive things and negative things. So that's much more who I'm drawn to. And there is no more biblical character that fits this bill than David. So for me, that's kind of my explanation of why I did that. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And how can I stop sharing? Meeting's being recorded, stop share. Okay. And now we're going to go to David. And we're going to read through, this should finish our time before David becomes king. And the last 2 times, we're going to look at somewhat of his kingship, what he brought to our people, and then his personal life. Right? If we want to really talk about flaws, we're going to have all kinds of things with David as a parent, as a husband, spouse, and the interplay in his life. So, Jeff, if you would, we could do the blessing together. All right, so we're on class 4, and we're dealing with Samuel 21. And now what we're coming to is a crossroads where David can no longer hide effectively from Saul. Saul's been trying to kill him over and over, pursuing him constantly. But he's getting to a point where it's becoming increasingly difficult, and we're going to see how that plays out a little bit here. Who would like to read Samuel 21, verse 10? Okay, thanks, Mark.
David then went his way, and Jonathan returned to the town. David went to the priest Ahimelech at Nob. Ahimelech came out in alarm to meet David, and he said to him, "Why are you alone and no one with you?" David answered the priest Ahimelech, "The king has ordered me on a mission, and he said to me, no one must know anything about the mission on which I am sending you and for which I have given you orders."
Is that true?
No.
Right, Saul hasn't said anything about this. David's making this up out of whole cloth. He's lying, right, to the priest because he's looking for shelter. And it's unusual that David would be alone. Think about who he is. He's the son-in-law of the king. He's a commander. He's one of the major generals in the military who travels alone. I mean, could you see the commander-in-chief of the United States just being out with nobody around him, with nobody supporting him?
Yeah, what's happening right now?
You know, but I'm talking about a military person who is a general. I mean, Eisenhower didn't walk around without aides and support. That's what you expect. Well, he sees him and he's there alone. What's going on here?
Abe Lincoln at the Fort Theater.
Well, he had a wife, but she didn't protect him.
And everybody learned from
Yeah,
that.
he actually did have a guard, but the guard was supposed to be sleeping. Right. Okay, let's go on.
Or drinking.
So I have directed my young men to such and such a place. Now then, what have you got on hand? Any loaves of bread? Let me have them, or whatever is available. The priest answered David, I have no ordinary bread on hand, there is only consecrated bread, provided the young men have kept away from women. In reply to the priest, David said, I assure you that women have been kept from us as always. Whenever I went on a mission, even if the journey was a common one, the vessels of the young men were consecrated. All the more than may consecrated food be put into their vessels.
So the food that the priests have are ready for sacrifice. They're the bread that is offered in the sacrifices. They don't have just any a Wonder Bread hanging around for those who remember those days. They've got only this stuff that's designed for sacrifice. And the guys, the men that are with David, who are not the officers that should be there, are just guys. They're soldiers. And he's saying, no, I don't let them mess around with women, and they are pure, whether they are or not. David, we know at this point, is going to make up any story he has to survive, and they need some food and they need some shelter. Okay.
So the priest gave him consecrated bread, because there was none there except the bread of display, which had been removed from the presence of the Lord to be replaced by warm bread as soon as it was taken away. Now, one of Saul's officials was there that day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg the Edomite, Saul's chief herdsman. David said to Ahimelech, haven't you got a spear or a sword on hand? I didn't take my sword or any of my weapons with me because the king's mission was urgent. The priest said, there's the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you slew in the valley of Elah. It's over there, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod.
That's right.
If you want to take that one, take it, for there is none here but that one. David replied, there is none like it. Give it to me. That day, David continued on his flight from Saul, and he came to King Achish of Gath.
Okay. So here he's fooling the priests of No, and he's doing it in order to get food for his men, and he doesn't even have a weapon. I mean, nothing. And now the priest is, I guess, naive, and he's not suspicious. It's David, after all, son of the king and commander. And David seems to have an answer to everything. We probe a little bit. You can see if Ahimelech would have probed, the story would have fallen apart. But he didn't. However, what David has just done is he's put the priests of No in a very bad position that they don't know they're in, because Saul is going to assume that they've helped David escape. And Saul will take vengeance on all of them. They will all die. That group is dead because of what David just did.
So would you say David is very conniving?
David
Or conniving?
is a
He's a
survivor,
survivor.
and he's going to do what he has to survive. I mean, after all, that from his standpoint, he hasn't done anything wrong. he's being pursued by a man who is out of his mind with hatred or jealousy or fear of David. And Saul has just driven him to this point, not where he wanted to be, or not where he thinks he deserved to be. He didn't do anything to Saul, but everything he's done, Saul has perceived as being done to attack Saul. That David is undermining everything that Saul has done, and Saul's position and Jonathan's position, and David is a conniver. Is he conniver? Not up until now, but at this point, whatever he's got to do to survive, he's going to do it. And now he's on the doorstep of the Philistines. He's crossed over from Judea, the territory of King Saul, and he's moved into the enemy, right? The Philistines are the enemy. Those are the ones that are constantly battling against the Israelites at this point. And that's who Saul and Jonathan, by the way, will be killed by. They'll be killed by the Philistines in a battle. So these are the Philistines that David is now seeking a way to hide there and still not betray Saul. And that's the path he needs to walk here. So when I talk about a complex person, and I'm talking about a person who has a checkered past, if you're looking at it from later on when David emerges as a viable candidate for the kingship, it's not unknown that he spent some time outside the borders, and that the question of the rumors of what he did or didn't do. And Saul and Saul's people certainly were spreading whatever lies about David because they wanted to paint him in the worst possible light, right? In order to justify the fact that Saul was trying to kill him. He wanted to kill him. You can't just kill one of the major generals without some kind of explanation. And so you paint that picture.
Well, what was the mission he was on?
It was a mission to get away from Saul. No, that was. Saul was pursuing him with all of his troops everywhere. We've read that before. So you missed that part.
Thank you.
But no, I'm saying, so the last few classes, we've been reading about Saul's throwing a spear at him and Saul's having his men pursue him. So at this point, David doesn't know where else to go within the borders. And he now has made his way to the doorstep of King Achish of Gath.
So is this, he's broke, he's got no money, because he can't even afford bread. So there's no support for his troops, for his people.
Right. He ran with his, he just, the clothes on his back. He didn't even take his sword, right? Clothes on his back. He and the guys that are with him they just skedaddled, right? As fast as they could get out of a skedaddle. What is that from Brother?
There's a story.
I can't remember this. There's a wonderful one. My brain doesn't work the way it used to.
Blazing Saddles.
Blazing Saddles. Well,
Boys?
just watch the tuchas. Follow my tuchas. Okay, here we go. That's not Blazing Saddles.
Two more Brooks
references
references
in one
day. What's that song? Doing the French dance at the end. Doing the French,
Okay.
or whatever.
All right, let's read on.
The courtiers of Achish,
Yeah.
the courtiers of Achish said to him, "Why, that's David, king of the land. That's the one of whom they sing as they dance. Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands."
Now, I will pause for a second. How do they know what he looks like? It's not like they had TV or movies or photographs. He's so well known, either he's been seen in battle, right? That they've seen his face enough that they know who he is, right? Or somehow he's not on a coin. We know we don't have coins of his.
Does he have the sword?
He has the sword of Goliath.
Maybe that was.
How many redheads were there? Did he have his sword? We don't know, but there is this notion that somehow that's pretty famous, right? To be famous enough in that world to be able to visually be seen by someone and say, that's the guy that killed Goliath and has been slaughtering us, right? That puts him at risk, wouldn't you say? Okay, so how's David gonna get out of this? Because we know he lives.
These words worried David, and he became very much afraid of King Achish of God. So he concealed his good sense from them. He feigned madness for their benefit. He scratched marks on the doors of the gate and let his saliva run down his beard. And Achish said to his courtiers, "You see the man is raving. Why bring him to me? Do I lack madmen that you have brought this fellow to rave for me? Should this fellow enter my house?"
Okay. Look at our clever David.
He's
Right?
quite
Look
the
at-
actor.
He goes off, I have to say, we had a professor, Dr. Wacholder at Cincinnati, who was professor of Talmud, who was so skilled in Talmud that literally he didn't bring the text with him, and the students demanded that he do, because it was disconcerting. And when he brought it, periodically he would hold it upside down. No, it didn't matter. He didn't need it, but the students needed a book in front of him. But he survived, the story he had told, he survived the Holocaust by doing exactly this.
Wow.
He pretended that he was insane and was clown-like. As an insane person, he would like dance around and say funny things and sing funny, strange songs and survive the Holocaust because the Nazis thought he was like, a funny guy, and they just tolerated it. And that's in effect what David does here.
Wow.
He pretends to be insane and just, a nuisance. And Achish obviously didn't recognize him. Achish didn't recognize him. The people around him did. And so he says, well, you must be wrong. Today we put it on the line and we'd go into photos and we'd see it, but there was no way to prove it. And so from his standpoint, this can't be David. This can't be the guy that's been killing us, right? This is just some nut. Okay.
The sword, the presence of Goliath's sword, which was probably distinctive because Goliath was a giant.
You would think,
You would think that Achish would say, "But what's he
if
doing
David
with
has it
Goliath's
on
sword?"
him,
Yeah.
David may not have brought it in with him. He may have left it with some other guys or somewhere. I mean, who knows? At this point, we don't hear a reference to the sword here. Okay, shall we? Yeah, Joe.
So I think Mark and Karen are the only ones in here who saw the play, right? So in the play, there's a very different encounter between David and Achish. It's where he goes over and makes a deal with Achish, right, for protection.
Right.
So how did you come to that?
Well, it's in here. No, I mean, this is only the first encounter with the Philistines. He will have a whole series of encounters with the Philistines, and he will actually become
So that's later.
just like in that there, he will do work for the Philistines. He just won't betray Israel. Philistines have more than just the Israelites as enemies. There's the Moabites, there are groups in that area that all have their armies and their interests. And the Philistines are not just fighting the Israelites for territory. This was all about territory, because territory gave you wealth, because it gave you more land. And in those days, land was crops, herds, right? Also slaves to work for you and make all of that stuff. There were also items that you could confiscate from other people that they had. Yeah, Mark.
I was just going to say, the text talking about your play versus Samuel, not versus, but in comparison. But when you get beyond the Torah, when you start studying the Ketuvim, and like in Knowlton and post-Knowlton, you've studied nearly all of them. Samuel it's like almost like a novel, like a proto-novel. The storytelling is really great because the characters, it's not just like in the Torah where you're talking about the Exodus and the commandments and all of that. It gets into individual stories,
Right.
And very compelling ones. And it's fascinating to proceed into those books after the Torah.
Well, and this story, the stories of David are the most complete, the most rich and deep of all the stories. And again, we're not gonna be doing them all. We're just doing some of them to give you this flavor. If you want to continue to read, just keep reading Samuel. Because that's where most of it appears. I mean, it all appears in Samuel and then beyond. So let's move on a little bit if we can. Oh, and there is so he does make a deal with the Philistines. In the earlier iteration of our musical, this scene was there, and there was a scene with him putting on Goliath's armor, him attempting to put on Goliath's armor. I mean, we toyed with a lot of scenes, and over the years, they just didn't work anymore for an hour and a half, 2-hour play. You know, you needed to be able to pick and choose what pieces you're going to do. So that's what we did. Okay.
Shall I continue?
Yes, please, if someone else wants to. Okay.
David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all his father's house heard, they joined him down there. Everyone who was in straits and everyone who was in debt and everyone who was desperate joined him, and he became their leader. There were about 400 men with him. David went from there to Mitzpeh of Moab,
Again,
and he said to
but
the
Moab is another country. You gotta think of these as countries, right? Philistia, Judea, Moab, these are all in that area.
So he said to the king of Moab, "Let my father and mother come and stay with you until I know what God will do for me." So he led them to the king of Moab, and they stayed with him as long as David remained in the stronghold. But the prophet God said to David, "Do not stay in the stronghold. Go at once to the territory of Judah." So David left and went to the forest of Hereth. When Saul heard that David and the men with him had been located, Saul was then in
Gibeah. Gibeah was his home. Gibeah is where Saul would live.
He was then in Gibeah, sitting under the tamarisk tree on the height, spear in hand, with all his courtiers and attendants upon him. Saul said to the courtiers standing about him, "Listen, men of Benjamin, will the son of Jesse give fields and vineyards to every one of you? And will he make all of you captains of thousands or captains of hundreds? Is that why all of you have conspired against me?"
Perfect timing.
That's them calling. "For no one informs me when my own son makes a pact with the son of Jesse. No one is concerned for me, and no one informs me when my own son has set my servant in ambush against me, as is now the case."
So wait 1 second.
Yeah.
So first of all, the fact that you heard that David had come back means that he had spies everywhere trying to figure out where David was, right? Someone's trying to track David and getting the word back to Saul. This is not, you don't have a telegram level. I mean, the only way to do it is physically, to traverse the territory and say David's back in there, which means someone had to be looking out for him. Okay, so now,
But also when his brothers and his father's house heard that he was in the cave, I mean, if they heard, Saul must have heard too.
right, there's, stuff's going on here that is not written, but we have to assume this is what's happening there. The whole country must know that there's something going on, and they're aware of it. So now we're here, and we have Doeg. Do you remember where Doeg was, where we met him before? He was with the priest at No, remember? He happened to be there. He's a herdsman. He was there to witness that exchange. Okay, so Doeg.
Doeg the Edomite, who was standing among the courtiers of Saul, spoke up. "I saw the son of Jesse come to Ahimelech, son of Ahitub at Noab. He inquired of the Lord on his behalf and gave him provisions. He also gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. Thereupon the king sent for the priest Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, and for all the priests belonging to his father's house at Nob. They all came to the king, and Saul said, 'Listen to me, son of Ahitub. Yes, my lord, he replied. And Saul said to him, why have you and the son of Jesse conspired against me? You gave him food and a sword and inquired of God for him, that he may rise in ambush against me, as is now the case? Ahimelech replied to the king, but who is there among all your courtiers as trusted as David, son-in-law of your majesty, and obedient to your bidding, and esteemed in your household? This is the first time that I inquired of God for him. I have done no wrong. Let not your majesty find fault with his servant, or with any of my father's house. For your servant knew nothing whatever about all this. But the king said, you shall die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house. And the king commanded the guard standing by, turn about and kill the priest of the Lord, for they are in league with David. They knew he was running away, and they did not inform me. The king's servants would not raise a hand to strike down the priest of the Lord.
Okay, so that, we have here that incident, that notion that the priests are sacred and the soldiers will not obey the king. Direct order from the king, right? They are obviously soldiers that are close to the king because he's ordering them. They're the ones around him. He's at, he's made a direct order. The king has made a direct order. And we're talking about in a monarchy, right? There's no constitution where we can go to the Supreme Court and argue it out. The king is the Constitution. He is, whatever he says is the law. And he says kill them. And the soldiers won't do it. Now, the king obviously could have the soldiers killed by other soldiers. But right now, his focus is on David and anyone who helps David. He wants these people killed because he believes they betrayed him directly with David.
Is this in the newspaper? Spelling mistake though, Dog is D-O-G.
D-O-G, right. Rabbi. Thank you. And now forever we'll have D-O-G-E there. Okay.
Oh,
All right, what do we got? What are we?
18. Therefore the king said to Doeg, you, Doeg, go and strike down the priest. And Doeg the Edomite went and struck down the priest himself. That day he killed 85 men who wore the linen ephod. He put Nob, the town of the priest, to the sword. Men and women, children and infants, oxen, asses, and sheep, all to the sword. But one son of Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, escaped. His name was Abiatar, and he fled to David. When Abiatar told David that Saul had killed the priest of the Lord, David said to Abiatar, I knew that day, when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would tell Saul, I am to blame for all the deaths in your father's house. Stay with me, do not be afraid, for whoever seeks your life must seek my life also. It will be my care to guard you.
Okay, there are a couple of things that are in here. One, there's a rule that if in any massacre someone survives. Someone gets the word out that the massacre took place. No massacre ever goes totally without being acknowledged.
Like Masada.
Masada,
Well, we don't know about those massacres.
That's true, and that would be possible. But here we have kind of this, typical thing, one gets out. Secondly, Saul is so focused and angry and out of his mind in some ways, that it's not enough to just kill the priests who were directly involved. He has to destroy the entire town, men, women, children, and animals, right? And has that, these are his own people. They're the people that are not only his subjects, they're part of his wealth. The animals, he even has them killed. They're all part of, in his mind, I suppose, this conspiracy. And remember, Doeg is not an Israelite. He's an Edomite. It's another country. These are little countries, but they're all countries, and they all are different peoples. And there's a lot of mixing and matching, particularly in military. David, we may not get to that story, I don't know. But with Uriah the Hittite, his wife is Bathsheba. Uriah is a soldier for David. He's a Hittite. The reason they have the name with it is to let people know he's not an Israelite. He doesn't have lineage within Israel, his lineage is elsewhere. So Doeg is from another place, and therefore has no necessary respect or reverence for the priests. The soldiers that are there seem to be all Israelites, and they can't kill a priest. And by the way, we will get to another point where David cannot kill Saul, even though he has an opportunity to, because he will not kill the anointed of God. They revered the system within Israel of holiness. If a priest served in that role, you could not disrespect him, let alone harm him, right? If God has chosen your king, you cannot kill the king. You cannot harm the king, even if the king is out to kill you.
But someone else can? You can have someone else do it?
Well, actually, that's the story of what actually happens. David doesn't have someone do it. I don't know that we'll get to it, so I'll say it. What happens is the sword bearer of Saul and Jonathan are in a battle with Philistines and they're losing. Jonathan is killed. Saul is wounded but gets away with his sword bearer away from whoever was trying to finish him. He's not dead. He says to his sword bearer, "Kill me so that I will not be captured." And he finally implores him to it, and he does it. He's the one who comes back and tells David, and he tells him what he did. Saul commanded, and David kills him. He says, "You do not kill the anointed of God." Well, because in his own self-interest, after all, he's going to be he believes he's the anointed of God. You don't want to have a precedent of killing the anointed of God, right? In fact, that was one of the things that happened up until Lincoln. No one had killed a president of the United States. We don't think about it. It wasn't just the tragedy it was the precedent. And from that time on, we've had to worry about and had instances of the killing of the leader. You know, the whole notion of kings, of the execution of Louis in France. That was a big thing, to actually execute what they thought was God's anointed. I mean, they believed it was God's anointed. They hated him and they despised what he did, but they still had a fear of God and what God might do. And for some of them, what followed after the king, which was terror, right, in France, for a very long time until it settled down, was the punishment for killing God's anointed, right? That was one of the ways it was seen. So in this case, David could not be the one who would do that, nor could his men be the one. He couldn't order it, right? Okay. Now we go to Ein Gedi, one of my favorite spots in all of Israel. How many of you have been to Ein Gedi?
No.
Yeah.
The hiking in Ein Gedi is beautiful, going beyond, up to the waterfall and going in. It's just beautiful there.
Yeah.
It's also a nature preserve now. So there are the goats of Ein Gedi, the wild goats of Ein Gedi. And it's a lovely area. And in seasons when there's water in Israel, there's a lot of water in Ein Gedi, natural water that flows down from Jerusalem. Okay. So we're going to get to Ein Gedi now. Okay. Who would like to read 24?
David went there.
Go ahead. No, go.
David went there and stayed in the wildernesses of En Gedi. When Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told that David was in the wilderness of En Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 picked men from Israel and went in search of David and his men in the direction of the rocks of the wild goats. And he came to the sheepfolds along the way. There was a cave there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the back of the cave.
You can't make this up. I mean,
They were in another stall in the meantime.
There's no sign on the door.
yeah, okay.
David's men said to him, "This is the day of which the Lord said to you, I will deliver your enemy into your hands. You can do it with him as you please." David went and stealthily cut off the corner of Saul's cloak. But afterwards, David reproached himself for cutting off the corner of Saul's cloak. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my Lord. The Lord anointed, that I should raise my hand against him, for he is the Lord anointed." David rebuked his men and did not permit them to attack Saul. Saul left the cave and started on his way. Then David also went out of the cave and called after Saul, "My Lord King." David looked around.
Saul looked around.
Oh, I'm sorry. Saul, my Lord King. Saul looked around and David bowed low in homage with his face to the ground. And David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the people who say, 'David is out to do you harm'? You can see for yourself now that the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave today. And though I was urged to kill you, I showed you pity. For I said, I will not raise a hand against the Lord, since he is the Lord's anointed. Please, sir, take a close look at the corner of your cloak in my hand. For when I cut off the corner of your cloak, I did not kill you. You must see plainly that I have done nothing evil or rebellious, and I have never wronged you. Yet you are bent on taking my life. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may he take vengeance upon you for me. But my hand will never touch you. As the ancient proverb has it, wicked deeds come from wicked men. My hand will never touch you. Against whom has the king of Israel come out? Whom are you pursuing? A dead dog? A single flea? May the Lord be arbiter, and may he judge between you and me. May he take note and uphold my cause, and vindicate me against you."
Okay, so obviously whoever is telling the story probably elaborated on this speech. It's a very long speech, considering where we are and what's going on, you know. And we don't hear from Saul. What is Saul at that moment thinking, doing? We don't get that from him. But this whole scene, and whether it existed or how it existed, the fact that they want to record all of these stories.
Yeah.
You know, part of recording the stories, the fact that they recorded such that David went to Achish, the fact that they will record stories about David working for the Philistines. They also record positive stories about him, but they're showing a very complete picture of what is a human being who is trying to rise above his station. He was a shepherd, the 8th son of Jesse, right? Last in line to inherit, if he would inherit anything, who has risen by his own mastery, his own skills, into this great position, who has raised himself up and now is in danger from the king, but is still trying to maintain his values. As much as he can, he's trying not to betray Israel. He's trying to keep his men in control. And remember, his men are not all Israelites. You saw the description of who his men were, right?
Yeah.
Basically, the outcasts of society, right? People, there was a whole list of who those people were that flocked to David.
Right.
You know, he doesn't have a trained troop. It's not even Robin Hood yet. I mean, it's Robin Hood before he got the merry men together and trained them. The merry men are there, but they haven't had time to be trained yet. And, you know, they're just having, a respite in a cave at En-Gedi. Those who've been to En-Gedi, you know that's where the whole area is filled with caves.
Yeah.
That's where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And there are caves throughout there. In fact, after the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, the people of that area just did nothing but go into caves for about 10 years, trying to find more parchments, because they were so valuable, right? And unfortunately did not find others. But who knows? There are literally thousands of these natural caves, and some that have been covered up but are still there and could be uncovered at some point. Okay.
This is a small point, but when we were there, I remember reading this story to our family. Here it says that Saul relieved himself. The story I remember reading was that Saul was asleep.
It's another story. It's in here. I'm telling you, there are a lot of stories. Yeah, it's another story.
First he went to the bathroom, then he took a nap.
No, I'm only showing you some of the stories, but there, as I said at the beginning of the class, you know, there might have been a number of different stories that got edited, redacted into this first book of Samuel. That may have come from many different sources. We believe that's how the Torah was put together. We believe that's how the Talmud was put together and the Mishnah. They were put together by various different pieces, and at a certain point, redactors made it into one unit. But it wasn't written by one person, and it isn't one story, but they also didn't feel they could leave some things out. Because they didn't know if both were possible. From their standpoint, if it was handed to them, this was precious. And it was unusual to get written material for people. We're so used to seeing writing everywhere. Most people couldn't read and didn't ever see writing, right? So when a piece of writing came to be preserved, it was understood to be very special, maybe even sacred. And so when they redacted it, there are many things that could have been edited out, but they couldn't do that. So they found ways to put it and make sense of it for them, because they didn't know the exact order of when it happened, and it didn't come down to them necessarily with a chronology, right? Just like there are 4 Gospels in the New Testament. Why are there 4 Gospels? There were actually dozens of Gospels. We now know many have been unearthed, many have been found. There were lots of Gospels floating around, but when the church fathers decided on what would be the ones that we will make the canon, the sacred canon, they chose those 4. And they excluded the others. And they made decisions as to why. We believe the same thing happened when the Torah was made, why Joshua didn't get in the Torah, the book of Joshua. After all, they entered the promised land with Joshua. Doesn't it make sense that you start the story with Abraham, who was promised the promised land, and you end it with the promised land? That seems like logical. It didn't get in because they decided that's not where it went. The Torah was ending with Moses dying before getting in the land. Because why? We can speculate why. We don't know. They didn't leave us notes. That would have been nice if we had Madison's notes, to figure out what went on in the room where it happened. But we don't have any of that. So we speculate. And that's what people make, PhDs on. They write PhDs about, these things. And they try to derive evidence from parallel stories. Okay, so yeah, these are the stories we have, and there are lots of them. So we're looking at them, and you can see how rich they are. And they are novel-like.
Totally novel-like.
I mean, it's very much, you're reading, it's so different from Torah. It's so different from what we're used to reading, even when we're in Genesis. Those stories are like kind of I don't know how to even describe. They're like short stories that have been short. The story's there, but there's so much texture missing that Midrash fills it. That's where Midrash shines. Midrash doesn't really focus on David a lot. I mean, There's so much here. What do you have to fill out? I mean, yeah, there's some, but not a lot. It's not like the midrash that you see for all the Torah stories, or even some other aspects that we see, like Psalms, trying to explain Psalms in midrashic terms.
Wow.
But this is so clear. The stories are just there. Okay.
Who would you write your next play about?
I don't believe there will be a next one. Okay, shall we move on? Let's finish up this section.
Okay, go ahead.
When David finished saying these things to Saul, Saul said, "Is that your voice, my son David?" And Saul broke down and wept. He said to David, "You are right, not I. For you have treated me generously, but I have treated you badly. Yes, you have just revealed how generously you treated me. For the Lord delivered me into your hands, and you did not kill me. If a man meets his enemy, does he let him go his way unharmed? Surely the Lord will reward you generously for what you have done for me this day. I know now that you will become king, and that the kingship over Israel will remain in your hands. So swear to me by the Lord that you will not destroy my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's house." David swore to Saul. Saul went home, and David and his men went up to the strongholds.
Do you think that's a real line?
Crazy is crazy.
Which one?
The line that Saul says, "Crazy is crazy." I mean, do you think Saul would have ever said something like that? The Saul that you've met?
No.
I don't know, if you got a guy with a big Goliath sword there, who you're, now been captured by, and he could take you, you might say anything to get out alive.
Okay.
We have to remember that Saul throughout the story is mentally troubled by it's either, I don't know whether it's schizophrenia or a split personality, what it is, but he is definite or manic depressive. He goes through cycles, and when he's down or totally up, he has conspiracy theories and he plots and he goes after them. Otherwise, his son-in-law, his dear son-in-law, his daughter is only, I don't know, his daughter's husband. He's very talented, and I guess I have to admit, he's always showed me loyalty. So it may be genuine shifts in Saul's mind. He may mean that right this minute. What he may mean tomorrow could be something different.
It's hard to have Rachmanis for Saul when he has somebody kill all the priests and everyone else. I mean, for the same reason that he was just embittered at David. I didn't realize he was that type of character, to be honest with you.
Well, it's, that's why the Bible is, I find it so rich and fascinating, is these are our people, this is our history, and yet we tell it with all of its really terrible moments as well as its glorious moments. And because that's what history is. That's when I started with Teddy Roosevelt, when you tell his stories, he did wonderful things. And even, I think they said he was the first person to invite an African-American to dinner at the White House. I think it was Booker T. Washington. He also appointed the first female to an official position in the government. He did wonderful things, and of course the national parks and all of that. But you can't tell a story if you're really telling a story. You also got to tell this part of the story, that what he did to the Native Americans and the way he treated them, the way he handled them, because that's who he was, and that tells you that it's Thomas Jefferson's story without Sally Hemings. Right? If you want to, that's the way we learned Thomas Jefferson's story. Right? We didn't learn Thomas Jefferson with slaves that he never freed, and that he chose, instead of freeing slaves, to sell them in order to keep having wine and books. You know, I mean, I didn't learn that story in school, right? That wasn't the story I was taught. But it is the story the kids are taught today, which I think is healthier, because that is Thomas Jefferson. He was a human being who was torn between the ideal of all men are created equal, and women are not, and African Americans are not, right? I mean, in his mind, he somehow lived that way, even though he founded a university that was egalitarian in many ways, or at least in those terms, it was landowners could send their children there, their sons there. So he was very progressive in a lot of ways, but he also, you know, probably raped Sally whenever he wanted to, and had children with Sally, and, you know, and did whatever he did with the other 599 slaves that he had.
But so maybe he had to have some good if he was not God.
No,
He had to end it somewhat good.
I
So
think
maybe
Saul
that-
was good.
So that's why they ended it that way.
Well, they didn't end it. The story's gonna, you know, continues on. And Saul, you know, dies a soldier, you know, so he dies doing what it was that he was appointed to do. He was appointed because he was big and tall and a great soldier. And that's what the qualities were that Samuel saw in him. God rejects him for other reasons, but it may be that he looked like he was the right king, and then over time it became clear he wasn't the right king. Was Jonathan the right successor? Maybe he was. Maybe he was not strong enough. You know, we see Jonathan kind of becoming David's shadow, and willingly doing that. He willingly stays in David's shadow, and he believes in it the way the story is told. He and Michal both see David in light that they don't see Jonathan. We use that in our play. You know, that Michal sees him as, you know, he says, David, you know, Jonathan is no David, is the line we use. Jonathan is no David. Jonathan is great, but he's no David. That's how I would read that story. They perceive something, and Saul also perceives it, and that's what maybe drives him over the edge. Whatever it is that drives him over the edge, it's focused on David. And it might be that he sees that David is destined for what he wants Jonathan to be destined for. And he doesn't see that Jonathan may not be the best candidate.
Rabbi, there was, when Saul went in to relieve himself in the cave, I was reminded of another scene where in the Godfather, where there's a bathroom scene and Michael comes out blasting. So maybe Saul did recognize that, yeah, he could have been slain. And
You know, it's funny, there must have been a number. The one that I think is leave the gun, take the cannoli. Because that's also a urination scene. Anyway, and with that note, I'll say Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.